The Preserver fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of Earth's solar system, and Admiral Korthak surveyed the small human defense force with contempt. 63 warships from 12 species faced a handful of human vessels that were barely capable of interstellar travel. And the outcome of any battle would be so one-sided that it could hardly be called a war. But before Korthax could give the order to advance, his sensors detected something that made his blood run cold. The precursor structure in Earth's asteroid belt, dormant for millions of years until a week ago, was now fully active and broadcasting on frequencies that no living species could produce similar. Reports flooded in from across the galaxy as every awakened precursor structure began transmitting. In perfect synchronization, Ambassador Yun Sojin stood on the bridge of the human flagship Endeavor and watched the massive alien fleet hold position, while everyone waited to understand what was happening. Captain Park Jin-hee reported that the precursor structure was projecting something, and moments later, a holographic image appeared in the space between the two fleets. It was not a weapon, it was a message. The projection showed a being that Yun assumed was a precursor, though it looked nothing like any species she had encountered. And its form seemed to shift and change, as if it existed in more dimensions than human eyes could perceive. The being spoke in a language that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow every listener understood the words as if they were being spoken directly into their minds. The precursors had seeded life across the galaxy billions of years ago because they believed that intelligence was precious and that consciousness was the universe's way of understanding itself. They had guided the development of countless species and had helped young civilizations avoid the mistakes that had destroyed so many others before them. But in their guidance, they had discovered a terrible truth. The species they cultivated were intelligent, but dependent, capable, but not creative. And they could follow paths that were shown to them, but could not imagine new paths of their own. The precursors had made their children too well, and in doing so, they had limited what those children could become, so they had tried an experiment. They had sealed away a handful of worlds and had forbidden any interference with whatever developed there. And they had waited to see what would happen when life grew without guidance. Most of the sealed gardens had failed, and the life there had destroyed itself or had never developed intelligence at all. The one garden had succeeded beyond anything. The precursors had imagined Earth had produced a species that was chaotic and violent and often cruel to itself. But it was also creative and adaptable and capable of growth that the cultivated species had never achieved. Humans had learned to fly without being taught that flight was possible, and they had split the atom without knowing that atoms could be split. And they had reached the stars without anyone showing them the way. They were what sapient life looked like when it grew wild. The precursor projection turned to address the gathered fleets directly, and its voice carried the weight of absolute authority. The inheritance was not rulership because the precursors had never believed that anyone should rule anyone else. The inheritance was responsibility. The cultivated species of the galaxy had reached the limits of what they could achieve through guidance, and they needed teachers who could show them how to grow beyond their design. Humans were those teachers, not because they were better or more powerful, but because they had learned to learn without being taught. The projection began to fade. But the precursor spoke one final time and said that the choice belonged to the living. The structures would provide knowledge and tools for those who wanted them, but they would not force anyone to accept what was offered. The galaxy could embrace the unsealed children of Earth, or they could destroy them and return to the comfortable limits of their cultivation. The precursors were long gone, and they would not return to enforce their wishes. Whatever happened next was up to those who remained. The projection vanished, and silence hung over the two fleets as everyone struggled to understand what they had witnessed. Admiral Korthax stood on his bridge and stared at the space where the precursor had appeared. And for the first time since the crisis began, he felt something other than fear. He felt shame. He had been ready to destroy an entire species because ancient words had frightened him. And now he learned that those words had been a gift rather than a warning. His communication officer reported that the Morvith flagship had broken from the coalition and was standing down. And moments later, the Theshan ships followed, and then the consortium vessels powered down their weapons. One by one, the species who had joined the blockade withdrew as they realized that whatever humanity represented, it was not a threat. Korthax was the last to give the order, and his voice was quiet as he told his fleet to return to Council Space, Ambassador. Yun watched the alien warships turn away from Earth, and she allowed herself to breathe for the first time in what felt like hours. Captain Park asked what they should do now, and Yun was quiet as she considered the enormous responsibility that had been placed on humanity's shoulders. She said that they would do what humans had always done when faced with the impossible. They would figure it out together. Communication came through from the Morvith flagship, and Elder Kasivith's rumbling voice filled the bridge as she said that she would like to be the first to formally request that humanity teach her people how to imagine new paths. Yun smiled and said that humanity would be honored to try, though. She warned the Elder that humans were not particularly organized teachers and tended to learn through failure as much as success. Kasivith laughed and said that perhaps that was the first lesson they needed to learn over the following days and weeks. Representatives from dozens of species came to Earth to begin a dialogue that would reshape galactic civilization. The precursor structures continued to provide knowledge and tools to those who sought them, and slowly the fear that had gripped the galaxy began to transform into curiosity. Humanity did not become rulers or conquerors, and they did not claim the inheritance that some had expected them to take. Instead, they became something that the galaxy had never seen before. They became teachers who admitted they did not have all the answers, and learners who remained curious even as they taught, and friends who welcomed anyone who wanted to grow beyond the limits that had been placed on them. Ambassador Yum Sojin stood at her window in the rebuilt human delegation headquarters and watched ships from 100 worlds arrive at station Varith Prime for the first joint conference on unrestricted development. Her aide Choi Minseo joined her and said that the precursors had been right about one thing. Yun asked what that was, and Minseo smiled as he said that the Unsealed had inherited something precious. They had inherited the chance to show the galaxy that growing wild was not something to fear. It was something to celebrate. Yun nodded and turned from the window to prepare for the conference. And outside, the stars continued their eternal dance as the children of Earth began to teach the galaxy how to imagine new paths among them. The Galactic Council chamber had never been so divided. And Ambassador Yun Seojin watched from the observation gallery as species who had been allies for millennia screamed accusations at each other. 3 factions had emerged in the week since the precursor structures began activating, and none of them could agree on what to do about humanity. The first faction called themselves the Preservers, and they were led by Admiral Korthax of the Vril military command, who stood on his platform with his neck frills fully extended in a display of aggressive dominance. Korthax argued that the precursors had clearly sealed Earth because something dangerous lived there, and the activation of the ancient structures proved that humanity's emergence had triggered a catastrophe that the precursors had tried to prevent. The only solution was immediate quarantine or destruction of the human homeworld before whatever was awakening could complete its purpose. Yun felt sick as she listened to a being she had once considered a friend call for the extermination of her entire species. The second faction was smaller but equally passionate, and they called themselves the Inheritors because they believed that the Unsealed will inherit was a prophecy that humanity was destined to lead the Blade. Galaxy High Priest Vallani of the Theshan religious order spoke for them and declared that the precursors had clearly intended for humanity to emerge at this moment in galactic history. The Council should welcome humans as their natural leaders and prepare to serve whatever purpose the Ancient Ones had designed. Yun found this faction almost as disturbing as the first, because she had no desire to rule anyone and suspected that humans would make terrible galactic overlords. The third faction was the largest and was led by High Counselor Varish of the Morvith, and they simply wanted to wait and observe until more information became available. Varish argued that making permanent decisions based on incomplete data was foolish, and she reminded the Council that the precursor structures had not yet revealed their purpose. But waiting was becoming harder as panic spread through Council space reports arrived every hour of new structures coming online, and each activation sent waves of fear through species who had built their civilizations in the shadow of monuments they did not understand. Trade routes were disrupted as ships refused to travel through sectors where precursor technology had awakened, and economic chaos was spreading faster than any fleet could move. Yun had requested permission to address the Council directly, and after hours of debate, Varish had finally convinced enough members to allow it. She stood and walked to the speaker's platform as hundreds of alien eyes turned toward her, and she felt the weight of billions of human lives resting on whatever she said next. Yun began by acknowledging that she understood their fear because humanity had been afraid too when they first learned they were not alone in the universe. She said that humans had spent their entire history wondering if they were special or just accidents of nature, and they had never found an answer that satisfied everyone. But one thing humans had learned through their long and often bloody history was that judging entire peoples based on fear rather than evidence always led to tragedy. The precursors had written words about Earth millions of years ago, and no one truly knew what those words meant or why they had been written. To condemn humanity based on ancient prophecies was to become the kind of beings who burned witches and persecuted innocents because they were different. Admiral Korthax interrupted and demanded to know how Yun could explain the activating structures if not as proof that humanity was a threat. Yun admitted that she could not explain the structures because no one could explain them yet, but she pointed out that the structures had not attacked anyone and had not threatened anyone and had simply begun to wake up. Perhaps they were weapons, and perhaps they were warnings, and perhaps they were something else entirely that none of them could imagine. Destroying humanity now would not deactivate the structures, and it would not undo whatever the precursors had set in motion. It would only prove that the Council was willing to commit genocide based on fear and speculation. High Priest Valami called out that Yun had not addressed the prophecy and asked if humans were prepared to accept their role as inheritors of the galaxy. Yun turned to face the Deshan and said that humans had never asked for any role and would not impose one. If the galaxy wanted to learn from humanity, then humans would teach what they knew. But they would not rule, and they would not conquer. That was not who humans were. Counselor Bareth stood and asked Yun what humans wanted if not power or control. And Yun was quiet for a moment as she considered the question. She said that humans wanted what they had always wanted, which was to explore and to learn and to build connections with others who shared those dreams. They wanted to understand the universe and their place in it, and they wanted to leave something better for those who came after them. They did not want to be defined by words written by beings who had never met them and who had vanished before humans had learned to make fire. Yun said that she could not promise the Council that humanity was harmless because no species was truly harmless, but she could promised that humans would rather be friends than enemies, and she could promise that they would face whatever was coming together. With anyone who stood beside them, the chamber was silent when she finished. And for a moment, Yoon allowed herself to hope that her words had reached them. Then alarms began blaring throughout the station, and emergency announcements declared that a coalition of Preserver faction ships had broken from Council Command and was moving toward Earth's solar system. Admiral Korthax had not waited for the Council to decide. He had decided for them. Yun watched in horror as the holographic displays showed dozens of warships engaging their faster-than-light drives and heading for her home. And she realized that diplomacy had failed. The war faction had grown tired of debate, and they were going to blockade Earth regardless of what the Council decided. She turned to High Council of Arish and asked what could be done. And the ancient Morvith's expression was grim as she admitted that Korthax had powerful allies and that stopping him might require force, that the Council was not prepared to use Yun's communication. Band buzzed with an urgent message from Earth's Defense Command, and she knew without reading it that her people had detected the incoming fleet. The time for words was ending, and what came next would determine whether humanity survived their first decade among the stars. The Morvith were the oldest living species in the Galactic Council, and their memories stretched back further than the written records of most civilizations. Ambassador Yun Seojin stood in the ancient meditation chamber of Elder Kasiveth and tried not to stare at the being who had lived for over 12,000 years. Kasiveth's massive form filled most of the chamber, and her gray-green skin was marked with patterns that Yun had been told represented the accumulated wisdom of her entire species. She had agreed to meet with the human ambassador only after a faction of moderate counselors had convinced her that destroying humanity without understanding them would be a mistake, worthy of the fearful rather than the wise. Yun bowed in the manner she had been taught and thanked the elder for agreeing to speak with her, and Kasiveth's great eyes studied her with an intensity that made Yun feel like her entire soul was being examined. The elder's voice rumbled like distant thunder as she said that she had watched many species rise and fall over her long life, and she had learned that fear was a poor guide for important decisions. Yun asked if Kasiveth knew why the precursors had sealed Earth, and the elder was quiet for so long that Yun wondered if she had given offense. Finally, Kasiveth spoke and told Yun that the Morvith had fragmentary oral histories that dated back to the time when the precursors still walked among the stars, and these histories spoke of the sealed gardens in terms that other species had long forgotten. The precursors had categorized worlds by their potential, and most worlds were marked as gardens to be cultivated and guided toward the development of intelligent life. Some worlds were marked as dangers to be avoided because they contained conditions that would produce hostile or unstable species, but the sealed gardens were different. Kasiveth leaned closer to Yun, and her ancient eyes held something that might have been wonder or might have been fear. The sealed gardens were worlds that contained something so significant that the precursors themselves had chosen not to interfere. And the seal was not meant to keep something dangerous contained. The seal was meant to keep everyone else out until the contents were ready. Yun asked what the contents were supposed to be ready for, and Kasiveth admitted that this was where the Morvith histories became unclear. Some stories said the sealed gardens were experiments, and others said they were gifts, and still others said they were warnings. What the Morvith did remember clearly was that the precursors had believed deeply in the importance of unguided development for certain worlds, and they had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure that no outside influence would touch those worlds until some unknown condition was met. Yun thought about this and said that humans had developed entirely without knowledge of alien life until they built ships capable of reaching other stars. And she asked if that was the condition the precursors had been waiting for. Casaveth said that this seemed likely because the precursor beacons that should have warned travelers away from Earth had apparently failed long ago, and no one had realized that a sealed garden existed in that remote corner of the galaxy. The seal had been broken the moment humans left their solar system, and no one had noticed because no one had been watching. Yun asked about the secondary glyph that had terrified the council, and Casaveth's great body shifted in a way that Yun interpreted as discomfort. The unsealed will inherit was a phrase that appeared in several precursor records, and its meaning had been debated by scholars for millennia. Some believed it was a prophecy that the species emerging from sealed gardens would eventually surpass all others. Some believed it was a warning that unsealed species would bring destruction, and some believed it was simply a statement of fact about the natural order of things, that those who grew without guidance would eventually outgrow those who had been cultivated. Casaveth told Yun that she did not know which interpretation was correct, but she had lived long enough to know that prophecies were dangerous things that often caused the very outcomes they predicted. If the Council attacked humanity out of fear that humans would destroy them, then they would create exactly the enemy they feared. Yun agreed and said that humans had not known. They were sealed and had not broken out through malice, but had simply grown as all life does and reached. For the stars, Casaveth was quiet again before asking Yun a question that surprised her. The elder wanted to know what humans believed about their own nature and whether they thought they were special or simply another species among many. Yun considered the question carefully and said that humans had always struggled with this question themselves. They had religions that told them they were chosen by gods, and they had sciences that told them they were accidents of chemistry, and they had philosophies that argued both positions and everything in between. What humans believed most strongly was that they had the right to determine their own future, regardless of what anyone else thought they should be. Casaveth made a sound that Yun realized was laughter, and the elder said that this answer told her more about humanity than any translation ever could. A species that refused to be defined by others was exactly what the precursors might have been, trying to grow in their sealed gardens. The elder rose slowly and told Yun that she would speak to the council on humanity's behalf and argue that destroying a species based on ancient words was the act of cowards rather than civilized beings. But she warned Yun that fear was a powerful force, and the council might not listen to reason. Yun thanked Casaveth and asked if there was anything else she should know, and the elder paused at the door of the chamber. Casaveth said that her contacts in the archive division had reported something troubling, and this news had not yet reached the full council. Precursor structures across the galaxy that had been dormant for millions of years had begun activating, and their energy signatures matched those recorded at the moment of humanity's first interstellar flight. Something vast and ancient was waking up, and it was responding to humanity's presence among the stars. Yun felt her heart freeze as she asked what the structures were, and Casaveth said that no one knew, because they had been silent and dead for so long that most species had forgotten they existed. But whatever they were coming online now, and the council would have to decide what to do about humanity before they learned what the precursors had left behind. The elder departed, and Yun stood alone in the ancient chamber as she realized that the situation had become far more complicated than she had imagined. Humanity was not just facing the fear and prejudice of alien species who distrusted them. They were standing at the center of something that had been set in motion millions of years ago by beings whose power and knowledge made the entire Galactic Council look like children playing with toys, and whatever was waking up across the galaxy was waking up for them. 3 days had passed since the ceremony, and Ambassador Yoon Seojin had received no official communication from the Council, despite sending 17 formal requests for information. She sat in her office at the human delegation headquarters and stared at the reports her team had gathered from unofficial sources, and none of what she read made any sense. Council species were recalling their ambassadors from Earth at an alarming rate, and trade negotiations that had been proceeding smoothly for months had suddenly been frozen without explanation. The worst part was the silence, because even the species who had been humanity's strongest supporters refused to answer her calls. A soft chime announced a visitor at her door, and Yun was surprised to see Counselor Bareth of the Consortium standing in her doorway with her long blue robes pulled close around her slender body. Bareth was one of the few aliens who had shown humans consistent friendship, and she had helped Yun navigate council politics more times than Yun could count. The Consortium counselor glanced nervously down the corridor before stepping inside and asking in a low voice if they could speak privately, and Yun immediately activated the security shields that would prevent any surveillance. Bareth settled into a chair designed for her species and told Yun that she was taking a great risk by coming here because the Council had issued unofficial guidance that members should limit contact with humanity. Yoon asked why and demanded to know what the translation had revealed, and Bareth was quiet for a long moment before she answered. The precursor designation for Earth, translated into common speech as something like the Sealed Garden or the Quarantine World, and this name had triggered an ancient protocol that most council members did not even know existed. Yun felt cold spread through her chest as she asked what that meant, and Bareth explained that the precursors had marked Earth with the highest restriction classification in their entire system before they vanished millions of years ago. The archive entry for Earth had been locked away in what the Council called the Forbidden Archive, a collection of records so old and so sensitive that only the most senior officials even knew of its existence. Yoon asked if anyone knew why the precursors had sealed Earth, and Bareth shook her head and said that the records were fragmentary and much had been lost over the ages, but the very existence of the classification had sparked panic, because in all the millions of worlds catalogued by the precursors, only a handful had ever been designated as sealed gardens, and none of those worlds had ever produced spacefaring life until now. Yun tried to process this information and asked what the Council believed a seal meant, and Bareth told her that opinions were divided, but fear was winning. Some believed the precursors had sealed Earth because something dangerous lived there, and they argued that humanity had been locked away like a disease that should never be allowed to spread. Others thought the seal might have been protective rather than restrictive, but they could not explain what the precursors had been protecting or why the result was chaos. And the Council had entered emergency closed session to debate what should be done about humanity. Yoon asked if she would be allowed to address the Council and defend her people, and Bareth's expression told her the answer. Before the counselor even spoke, humanity was excluded from the deliberations because the Council could not reach consensus on whether humans should even be considered a legitimate member species given this new information. Some factions were already calling for humanity to be expelled from Council space entirely, and others were demanding that Earth be quarantined just as the precursors had apparently intended. Yun stood and walked to her window and looked out at the vast station that surrounded the human delegation headquarters, and she watched ships of a dozen species moving through the traffic lanes. While she tried to understand how everything had gone so wrong so quickly, she asked Bareth what she thought. And the counselor was silent for a long time before admitting that she did not know what to think. Bareth had always believed humans were simply another young species finding their way among the stars. Curious and sometimes clumsy, but fundamentally good. But the precursor designation had shaken her because the precursors had never been wrong about anything in all the millions of years their records had been studied. Whatever they had seen in Earth had been significant enough to warrant their highest level of restriction. And that had to mean something. Yun turned back to face her friend and said that she refused to accept that her people should be judged by words written millions of years ago by beings no one truly understood. Bareth agreed that this was reasonable, but warned that reason was in short supply at the moment. And she told Yun that she should prepare for difficult days ahead before she left. Bareth shared one more piece of information that she had learned from a contact in the Archive Division. The precursor designation for Earth included a secondary glyph that the archivists had only recently managed to translate. And this glyph was what had truly terrified the council. Yun asked what the glyph said, and Bareth met her eyes with an expression that mixed wonder with fear. The unsealed will inherit. Bareth departed without another word, and Yun stood alone in her office as the weight of those 4 words settled over her like shroud. She did not know what the precursors had meant or why they had sealed Earth away from the rest of the galaxy for millions of years, but she knew that half the galaxy now believed humanity had been locked away for a reason, and she knew that proving them wrong would be the greatest challenge her species had ever faced. She activated her communication band and called Choi Min-seo and told him to gather the entire diplomatic team because they had work to do. Whatever the precursors had intended for humanity, Yun was determined that her people would write their own future rather than be defined by ancient words they had never known existed. The stars outside her window continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas of mortal species. And somewhere in the Forbidden's archive, the full record of Earth waited to reveal secrets that had been hidden since before life on Earth had crawled from the oceans. Ambassador Yun Seo-jin adjusted her formal jacket as she waited in the massive circular chamber of the Galactic Council headquarters on Station Vareth Prime, and she told herself this was simply routine business and nothing more. The chamber stretched upward for what seemed like forever, with floating platforms holding delegates from over 300 species who had gathered to witness another world join their ancient registry of known civilizations. Humanity had been in contact with the Council for only 12 years, and during that time they had proven themselves peaceful and curious and eager to learn. So today was meant to be a celebration of their full acceptance into galactic society. Yun had prepared a short speech thanking the Council for this honor, and she had practiced the traditional greeting gestures for 17 different species, and she had memorized the names of every senior counselor who might approach her. Afterward, none of that preparation had readied her for what was about to happen. The ceremony began with High Archivist Threnis of the Vela species stepping forward on her 4 delicate legs while carrying an ancient device that glowed with soft blue light, and she announced in her melodic voice that the Universal Registry would now receive the formal designation of humanity's homeworld. This was the part Yun had been told about during her briefings, and she understood that the precursors, who had seeded life across the galaxy billions of years ago, had left behind a linguistic system that could translate any world's name into their ancient tongue. The translation was considered sacred by most council species, because it supposedly revealed the true nature of a world and its people. And though Yun personally thought it was superstitious nonsense, she respected its importance to her new allies, Threnis held the device toward the holographic image of Earth that floated in the center of the chamber, and the device hummed as it processed the data about this small blue world from an unremarkable arm of an unremarkable galaxy. Yoon watched with polite interest as the device projected symbols she could not read, and she waited for Threnis to announce the translation so they could move on to the reception where real diplomatic work could happen. But Threnis did not announce anything. Instead, the Velith archivist went completely still, and her large eyes grew even larger, and her four hands began to tremble so badly that she nearly dropped the ancient device. Yun stepped forward with concern and asked if something was wrong. But Threnis did not respond and instead pressed a button on her communication band, while never taking her eyes from the projected symbols. Within moments, two more archivists arrived. An elderly Corvan whose gray skin had gone pale, and a young Deshan whose bioluminescent patches were flashing in what Yun had learned was a sign of extreme distress. They huddled around the device and spoke in rapid whispers that the translation systems could not quite catch. And Yun noticed that delegates throughout the chamber were beginning to murmur with confusion and growing unease. High Counselor Varesh of the Morvith species, one of the oldest beings Yun had ever met, rose from her floating platform and demanded to know the cause of this delay in her deep rumbling voice. Threnis looked up at the High Counselor with an expression that Yun could only describe as terrified, and she requested in a shaking voice that the ceremony be suspended for immediate verification of the translation results. The chamber erupted into chaos. Delegates shouted questions in dozens of languages while their translation devices struggled to keep up. And Yun found herself surrounded by alien faces that ranged from confused to alarmed to openly frightened. She tried to approach Threnis to demand an explanation, but Council security officers had already formed a barrier around the archivists, and they politely but firmly refused to let anyone through. High Counselor Varesh called for order and announced that the session would be suspended until the archivists completed their verification. And she assured everyone that there was certainly a reasonable explanation for this irregularity, but Yoon had been a diplomat long enough to recognize fear when she saw it. And Varish was afraid as the delegates began filing out of the chamber. Yun noticed something that made her stomach tighten with worry, and it was the way that species who had been friendly to humanity for years were now avoiding her. Gay's ambassador Kathos of the Vril had always greeted her with warmth, but now he hurried past without acknowledgement, and his neck frills pressed flat against his scales. In what she knew was a defensive posture, Trade Minister Beliath of the consortium had promised to introduce Yun to potential business partners after the ceremony, but now she walked in the opposite direction and spoke urgently into her communication device. Even young attached Mirren of the Deshans, who had told Yun just yesterday that she hoped to visit Earth someday, now looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been fear. Yun stood alone in the emptying chamber and watched the archivists continue their frantic work around the glowing device. And she wondered what possible translation could have caused such a reaction. She knew the precursor language held great significance to Council species because they believed it revealed fundamental truths about the nature of things. But surely a simple name could not cause this level of panic. Her communication band buzzed with an incoming message from the human delegation's headquarters, and she answered to hear the worried voice of her aide Choi Min-seo asking what had happened and why the ceremony had been suspended. Yun told him she did not know, but would find out, and she instructed him to begin monitoring all council communication channels for any mention of Earth or humanity. As she turned to leave the chamber, she caught one final glimpse of the holographic Earth still floating serenely in the center of the room. And she thought about all the billions of people back home who had no idea that something about their world had just frightened some of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. She did not know what the precursors had called Earth in their ancient language, and she did not know why that name had caused such terror among species who had traveled the stars for millennia. But she knew with absolute certainty that the simple ceremony she had expected had become something far more complicated. And she knew that the future of humanity's place in the galaxy might depend on what she did next. Yan straightened her shoulders and walked out of the chamber with her head held high, because whatever was coming, she would face it the same way humans had always faced the unknown. She would face it with courage and determination, and the stubborn refusal to accept that any problem was too big to solve. The doors closed behind her with a soft hiss, and somewhere in the vast archives of the Galactic Council, the true name of Earth glowed on a screen while archivists scrambled to understand what it meant that the sealed garden had finally opened.